It's somewhat of the difference. You can learn from other creative industries. But what is the value for people who write for a living? What's the value of an editor, right? And getting leaders to understand that they don't always have to be the author, right? Sometimes they're the editor. Sometimes they're the curator.
For people who feel like, my distribution's okay, but I feel like I should be upgrading it. What are levers they could pull? What are questions they should be asking themselves and their teams?
There's always a fundamental choice that I think as a leader or as a marketer, you have to be thinking about when you're thinking about growth, which is fundamentally, do you optimize the existing channels you have? How can you grow them, right? Can you boost the traffic from them? Can you boost the conversion rate? Can you reach more people this way, et cetera? Or are you opening up new channels?
Welcome to Innovation and Leadership. I'm Jess Larsen. On this episode, we've got Adam Nash, CEO of Daffy. Adam, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, just happy to be here.
Well, I've got a whole bunch of questions about a whole bunch of interesting things from your life. I want to talk about, as CEO of Wealthfront, how you grew from 100 million to over 4 billion, LinkedIn, Dropbox, all these things. But before we get into it, let's start off with Daffy. Daffy.org. I just signed up today. And I was really excited because I found the charity we started 14 years ago, Child Rescue Association, on there. So I got it scheduled for my first donation from myself just to see how it works. But for people who don't understand Acorn or the analogy of Acorn for charity, and who want to understand like how they can help both themselves giving and also maybe helping educate their kids, can you tell us about Daffy?
Yeah, happy to. And by the way, of course, Daffy is a cute name and all, but it stands for the Donor Advised Fund for You, which is kind of the financial backbone of what we're building. But Daffy's a really simple concept, right? It turns out about 60 million Americans give to charity every year. And giving isn't just a financial goal. Giving is, for a lot of people, something fundamental about how they think about living a good life. Like most of the people I talk to, most of our members had a parent or a teacher, an aunt, an uncle, a priest, a rabbi, someone who taught them that giving is part of living a good life, of not all of it's for you. It's not meant to be all selfish. And so a lot of people believe that. And there's been a lot of innovation in fintech over the last decade to help people spend better, save better, invest better. And Daffy was really built with a simple idea that we could apply all of that technology to help people actually give better. And so I'm really happy you were able to find your charity, of course. We do support almost every legal charity in the United States, over 1.7 million charities across the country. But the basic idea behind Daffy when you join is just to set a goal for your giving. And whether you want to put money aside in cash, you can use a card, a bank account, you can even donate stock, crypto. We support every crypto Coinbase supports. But we just try to make it very easy for you to put money aside for those less fortunate than yourself, have that money invested tax-free. And then anytime you find a charity that inspires you, a cause that moves you, you have the money put aside to give. And it's just a wonderful feeling. So that's the basic idea behind Daffy.
Oh, it's pretty awesome. I want to talk about this idea of how donors of, donor advised funds, like, billionaires on the show that I get to know, or people, family offices that support our charity and stuff. I end up having these conversations about their donor advised funds, but it's such a small percentage of the country that understands what an advantage is. Can you explain for people who aren't familiar with the model, how it works?
Yeah, for sure. And it's not surprising. I mean, the truth is, like I said, there's about 60 million households in the US who give to charity every year, but there's only a little over 1 million donor advised fund accounts. And that's not because it's new. Donor advised funds have been around for decades. But for the most part, if you don't have a wealthy financial advisor, wealth manager, if you don't have a high-end accountant telling you about the benefits, most people haven't heard of it. And frankly, a lot of that's because of the business model of the industry, right? The industry is mostly attached to investment shops that make money as a percentage of assets. And so they're looking for very large accounts. And so it's not surprising that mostly they cater to millionaires and billionaires, et cetera. The whole idea behind Daffy was saying that it doesn't have to be that way. The donor advised fund is kind of like an individual retirement account, except instead of for retirement, it's for charity. You put money aside, it's a tax advantaged account. And the only requirement, just like the requirement for a retirement account is to use the money for retirement, the requirement for the donor advised fund is to use it for charity. But it's a wonderful financial product, and it's a great piece of financial advice. And I'm hoping that taking advantage of modern technology and this fintech boom, that we can open up the donor advised fund to everyone who gives to charity at all regularly.
Will you correct me if I misunderstand this? Like right now is a great time of year at the end of the year. People who are like, oh man, for tax reasons, we need to give, but maybe they haven't exactly spent the time investigating where they want to give as much as they would have liked. They can get to their donor advised fund. You know, I saw the one like starts at like $3 a month or something with you, right? And then they can put the money in now, get the tax situation figured out here before the end of the year, and then next year they can decide which charities they're going to help out. Am I?
That's exactly right. Like, listen, most of my career is, kind of an engineering and design background. I care about the product, and that includes financial products. And the donor advised fund is a great financial product because it turns out giving is hard for most people for two reasons. One, you have to figure out how much you can afford to give. That's kind of a budgeting question. It's very hard for most people to just on the spot figure out how much they can spend on something. And then second, you have to figure out who to give the money to. And you're right, the IRS makes this even more difficult because that tax year is January 1st to December 31st, and they really don't budge on that, as it turns out. Or at least if they do, I haven't found out a way to get them to budge on that. And so the donor advised fund says, listen, you should be putting money aside for charity. You can put it in this account, get the tax deduction right away, right, this tax year, and then the money's invested. So you have time to figure out really the more important question, which is which organization deserves your gift, your support. And so that's why the donor advised fund is a great product. Now, of course, it's the end of the year. And for a lot of people, when they get a donor advised fund, they discover this extra benefit, which is that if you donate stock or assets like crypto or an ETF or a mutual fund, the tax benefits really are phenomenal because not only do you get that full charitable deduction for the value of the stock today, but you never pay the capital gains taxes on that appreciation. And so it's not surprising that at the high end, a lot of people realize, especially this time of year, that if they support a charity regularly, if they put money aside or if they write that check directly, that actually writing that check is not as advantageous as actually donating stock, putting it in a donor advised fund, getting that tax benefit, and then letting the donor advised fund get the cash to the charity you support.
Well, and I'll give a shameless plug for you guys. It took me like 5 minutes to sign up. Like I hooked my Chase account. It was, you've done great on the user experience because I was able to do it. So.
Well, listen, it doesn't have to be hard, right? And most of us are actually used to opening up different accounts. We open up bank accounts. A lot of us have opened up retirement accounts. Some of us may have even opened up college savings accounts like 529s. It doesn't have to be that hard. And it isn't that hard. And so we're really proud of the user experience. We make it very easy to put money aside. I mean, our mission is to help people be more generous more often. And so from our point of view, all these great engineers, all these great designers that we've hired who work for all these great companies around Silicon Valley, what's exciting to me is to see all that effort just focused around one idea, which is how do we make it as easy as possible when they're inspired to give and to give more. And so that's what Daffy is all about.
I love it. We get a bunch of different kinds of high achievers on the show, but definitely some of my favorites are the ones who've been part of these billion-dollar success stories in entrepreneurship. What I'd love to do is maybe go back through different parts of your career and have you share, billion-dollar success secrets. They're not a secret. And talk about what you observed at the time. Talk about how you're applying to Daffy, and talk about it maybe in a larger scope for the rest of us, founders or investment fund managers listening today as we try to think about it for ourselves. Can we maybe start with the days, trying to get into Next, ending up at Apple, working for Steve Jobs, talking about things like, Michael Dell thinks all of us employees shouldn't be here because we're destroying shareholder value. And I want you guys to think about BMW and how nobody cares what the market share is. Everybody wants one.
It sounds like you read up. I wrote a note. I wrote a post when Steve passed away, kind of about some of the lessons I had learned at Apple at that time, and so happy to talk about it. Those war stories, etc. But yeah,
but
I mean, you have to
specifically the principle there. Like you talked about at the time, your roommate guessed Apple was going to be out of business in 5 years. Like this is not the $2 trillion Apple of today. Can you talk about the principle at the time before the future was guaranteed, the principle that a principle or two that you saw there that has really stuck with you?
You that roommate actually ended up being a successful founder of a public company himself, and actually is an investor in Daffy. So all things end well amongst friends. But no, I'm happy to talk about it. It's a really important lesson, and so I think there's two lessons there. One is about when you dive into these companies, et cetera. What do you actually know at the time? I think people make a mistake. They look with 2020 hindsight, and they think that it's all predictable, et cetera. But believe me, no one was predicting that Apple would be worth $3 trillion in the year 2023 back in the 90s, right? The Business Week cover was, the fall of an American icon, right? Like my roommate was not alone in thinking that Apple wasn't going to be in business. Sun Microsystems actually had the opportunity to buy Apple for something like $2.5 billion and passed because it was too much money. So let's be clear. And I didn't set out to join Apple. I had been an intern there in the research labs. But I was interviewing with Next. I'd been referred by one of my mentors and kind of a faculty member at school who had done some work for them. And I interviewed there. And in the middle of my interview process, actually, this whole thing went down where Apple acquired Next, or maybe Next acquired Apple. I'm still not totally sure what happened there. But I was the interviewing, the hiring manager at the time, actually Craig Federighi, who runs software at Apple. Sent me this note saying, "Hey, I can't talk about it, but we'll talk more in January. Don't worry, it'll be fine." And sure enough, this big news came out. But I joined Apple largely because I was inspired by what that team was working on. The technology, the web was new. I was going to work on web objects. This idea that websites weren't just something that you designed or kind of built on the front end, but actually were programs. It was something you could build in software, and you could build software toolkits to do. Was something I was very excited about. But as you pointed out, I learned a lot of lessons there. And I mean, that meeting about Michael Dell, et cetera, has become kind of lore. I feel fortunate that I was one of the people in that room. But, to tell the story, Michael Dell, who at the time, I mean, Michael Dell's an amazing entrepreneur, obviously immensely successful, has done multiple turns. But in the 90s, he could not have been hotter, right? There were a handful of companies that made the 90s revolution, and Dell was one of them. And so, he, not surprisingly, he was asked, "What would you do to fix Apple Computer?" Right? And it makes sense. And it turns out that he said something along the lines, I don't want to misquote him, but something along the lines of like, there's some problems you can't fix, and then it, I think that I would return the cash to shareholders. Right. And so Steve called this meeting the next day. And as I remember, it was the entire Rhapsody team. Rhapsody was the code name for what became Mac OS 10 and iOS, the new operating system. And he got up on stage and said, he put Michael Dell up on this giant screen. I kid you. I don't know if this is just my memory playing tricks on me, but it could have been 10, 12, 15 feet tall. I don't know. Giant picture of Michael Dell, and said, "Michael Dell believes that every day you wake up in the morning, you kiss your family goodbye, you come to work, and you destroy value. He literally thinks that if we returned cash to shareholders, that would be better than paying for all of us to come to work every day and build things." And he said, "You know what? He's right. Because if we keep doing what we've been doing, we will keep destroying value." And he talked about what he thought the purpose of Apple was. And he asked this question: what market? At the time, everyone wanted to talk about market share. People still talk about market share. And it was big in the computer, and Apple had such small market share. And he said, "What market share, does BMW have? Does anyone know?" By the way, sometimes when Steve asks questions in meetings, you don't actually answer. Like that was part of it. He said, "Does anyone know?" "No, it's 1.5%. But the reason no one knows that? Because no one cares. Because you're either driving one or you're watching one when it drives by." And he talked about Apple making products that people actually lusted after, that they wanted emotionally, viscerally. And he talked about being a startup again and building value and what it meant to act that way and sharing equity. And it turned out that was a really valuable lesson, not just because it was inspiring or it was a kind of a team moment, or even with 2020 hindsight, that actually turns out we shipped a new Mac OS and it turned out to be the basis of this new vision that played out in more ways than one. But also turned out to be useful at other companies, right? I've been at other companies. I've been at several public companies that, have gone through ups and downs. I've been through now a number of private companies, startups that have gone public, and kind of everything in between. But these lessons in business tend to be fairly universal, right? What you do when you're down. I remember being at eBay when they were trying to turn around in the mid 2000s. And I reflected on the fact that eBay was having a hard time picking a lane. Did they want the market share, right, of a Toyota? Did that, at the time, eBay had like 20% market share of all e-commerce. It was very much like, do you want to be the everything store, like literally everything? Because then you're going to be like Toyota, right? It's just going to be almost like a utility. Like it's going to be good. Cars are good price, but nothing particularly special or inspiring. I'm going to get angry letters from Toyota fans. I'm sorry. I drive a Toyota. It's fine. It's all good. Or do you want to build something kind of inspired and different? I mean, even to this day, you'll notice that Apple does not focus on market share. That's not actually their driving force. They do focus on profits, and they do focus on the product, but they don't really care about market share. And that goes back now more than 25 years. And so, as I grew in my career, obviously from an engineer to product, director, an executive, a CEO, and a founder, these lessons, these people I had the good fortune to run into have been so influential about how I think about these things.
Well, let's switch to eBay then. What's a $1 billion success principle that you observed from your time there?
eBay is an interesting one and a tough one. So eBay was, the biggest lesson actually I learned with eBay, it'd be amazing, is actually it really locked in for me this decision matrix of how to pick companies to work for. I had learned this actually in my brief stint after business school. I'd been in venture capital for a couple of years. And being in the boardroom of a number of companies, working with great venture capitalists and CEOs, I learned some simple lessons, but I learned that there were certain types of companies which really ended up with almost an unfair access to talent, right? They were just the type of companies that amazing people went to work for, high quality people. These companies where they had found product market fit, right? They usually had a business model that worked. They usually had 10 million in revenue or more. They were growing 100% year over year. And they were backed by high quality people, right? Good people involved. And there are not a million of these companies, but every year there's actually more than you think. And so I remember, going out and looking for a company and looking for companies that fit this definition. And there were very few companies at the time growing 100% year over year, but eBay was one of them. It was really a phenomenal, even after the bubble burst, like the stock was down, but the business itself was phenomenal. And so, and the best thing about the eBay experience for me was really the people, right? It was true. A lot of other great people. If you look at the resumes of a lot of people, the quality of the people who were at eBay between 2000 and 2005 is really just a phenomenal set of individuals. But the big eBay experience for me was actually, besides the technology, it was my first Web 1.0 company, did a lot of work on search and relevance that became relevant. It was a little bit about entrepreneurship and what it means to build new products and services within a larger organization. I was set on a mission to build something new within eBay, which ended up being called eBay Express, which is really the simple idea, which says eBay is fantastic for buying used items or hard to find items, rare items. But when people are buying something that's more of a commodity, that, kind of new in season merchandise, they're just looking for trust and convenience, right? Yes, they want a good price, they want value, but they want to get it done. They don't want to worry about the shipping. They don't want to worry about how they're going to pay. They don't want to worry about if they have to return it, whether they can return it or not. And so the simple idea was saying, hey, we came up with this idea, said, hey, all of eBay doesn't fit that definition, but like a quarter of it does. And that quarter is bigger than almost anything else out there. What if we built a new marketplace was just for that stuff, where the buyer would know that they could return anything within 2 weeks, that it would be shipped different ways, they could pay with a credit card, all the things that you expect. And remember, this is before Amazon rolled out Amazon Prime or any of these things. It was a really exciting opportunity. And we dove in as a team. I think at one point we had hundreds of engineers working on this project, and we launched it within a year. It's phenomenal. But I learned a lot of lessons there. Some lessons that'll seem obvious now about, it's not enough to just build it and expect people to come. You have to have a traffic strategy. You have to have a distribution strategy. You have to have people coming in, but also the incentives in large organizations doing a turnaround. Like that lesson I talked about at Apple is not one to be taken for granted. It is very, very hard for large companies, especially public companies, to not end up iterating and optimizing for the business they have versus a hypothetical business in the future. And when that business is measured in billions or tens of billions of dollars, it's not like a normal entrepreneurship thing. Like it's not enough. I remember with eBay Express, we grew that business. I think we got to over 100 million in sales in the first year, which by the way, at the time was the fastest any e-commerce site had ever grown. But in a company that measured just individual categories in billion, 100 million, or the idea that we might hit a billion within a few years didn't seem big enough. And so to me, like, this is one of the things, echoing back to business school, one of my advisors in business school was a fabulous man and leader named Clay Christensen, came up with this
Such a
idea of
fan.
the innovator's dilemma, right? The famous book that he wrote. But my operating experience echoed the lessons that he had coming from academia, this idea that don't underestimate that the incentives of organizations are very hard to overcome. And in fact, to this day, when I give advice to founders, I tell them to be very, very specific about the business model that they choose for their company. Because in some ways, that business model is destiny, right? As you scale, you'll have thousands of people, all very smart and ambitious. And they will be working every day thinking of a way to make that business better. And so, in some ways, that business model you choose is your destiny. But in some ways, like I said, when I think of eBay right now, and I'm still an eBay user, as it turns out, I still, have to have some place where I can sell my old computers and iPhones and that sort of thing. But my biggest experience, it was wonderful to be part of one of the success stories of Web 1.0. And it was really impressive for me to see how these things scale over time, that what becomes easy and what becomes hard as you get bigger and bigger as an organization.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll skip around a bit instead of just going in chronological order. Okay. I love that, and I think it's such interesting insights. Let's talk about Wealthfront. And I believe you started off as COO, ended up being CEO there from 100 million over the 4 billion mark of dollars in. Can you talk about that story and the insight?
Sure. Pretty easy story. Although once again with 2020, I mean, Wealthfront just announced that they hit 50 billion in client assets, and I think over 700,000. Clients. It's just amazing how that business has scaled. And that was always part of the dream and the visions, that we would open up access to sophisticated financial advice well beyond the traditional industry. But you have to put yourself back in 2012. Fintech wasn't a word. I left LinkedIn after the IPO. I ended up transitioning and going to Greylock as an EIR, and I was looking for a new thing. And I was looking at a lot of these companies. I always have been very interested in personal finance. I mean, my senior project in college was to build a better Quicken. I don't think I succeeded at that time, but always had the passion for it. And this idea that everyone needed access to it. And so I was looking at a lot of companies, met a lot of great founders. And I remember meeting Andy Ratcliffe, and we talked about Wealthfront. I had been a client of Wealthfront. Wealthfront was a pivot. Wealthfront was not an obvious story. In fact, I think when I joined, the company only had a matter of months of cash left in the bank on a bridge. But I was incredibly inspired and excited about the product they had built. And they had figured out a means of distribution that I was very familiar with at LinkedIn, which is actually people loved Wealthfront so much, and they believed in the mission so much that they were recommending it to other people. A huge percentage of the customers of Wealthfront were coming from referrals from other customers. And that's something that's very hard to fake. Those numbers are either there or not there. And so, dove in. The CEO to CEO transition is a little bit more optics. It turns out, like my experience at LinkedIn, et cetera, bringing in an outside CEO is a very hard problem, right? Giving new leaders, establishing the moral authority to make those decisions, especially when you're not a founder, is a very hard problem. And so I decided I would come in as a COO, run things for a period of time to build that authority so that when I stepped into the CEO role, it'd be accepted. And so, Jeff Weiner did the same pattern at LinkedIn, which is, of course, was very successful, as the pattern was based on. He came in as president, not because he wasn't going to be CEO, but because it gave him time to not have all the answers on day one and have the moral authority to do it. But it was exciting. I mean, the hard part about Wealthfront, and for any product in an innovative new area, and this is where I've really spent my career, is people always want to frame the product around the existing industry. They always want to frame it around what it does today, how it makes money. But that's rarely the opportunity for a disruptive opportunity. Going back to those lessons from Clay Christensen, the innovator's dilemma, the incumbents are pretty good with it. They have distribution, they have reach, they have money, they have people. And those people are not foolish people. Those people are smart people who believe in what they're doing and are working hard to do it. I know it's fashionable in the startup world to pretend that big companies are somehow all slow and stupid, et cetera, but that has not been my experience working there or competing against them. And so, I mean, at LinkedIn, I can't tell you how many people would have framed that business around monster.com at the time, right? Because that was the big Web 1.0 success in recruiting and job seeking. And what a mistake it would have been to try and build Monster 2.0. Wrong answer. Same thing for Wealthfront. And so what we had at Wealthfront, though, was a very small team. I think it was 16 people when I joined, who really believed in this idea that we were just going to go one by one to every sophisticated piece of financial advice that added real value to the wealthy. And we were going to turn it into software so that everyone could have. And we just went on a march, 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, innovating, bringing things into software that hadn't been done there. I mean, think of all the things people talk about now in fintech. Direct indexing could not be hotter. We rolled that out December 2013, right? Tax loss harvesting has become something that almost everyone knows what that is. We put that into software, right? Actually in 2012, even right before I joined, it was when I was talking to Andy. And I was just very proud of all those innovations, that strategy. But, you know, every startup needs to have a strategy. Our strategy was to be a disruptor, to be an innovator, and to be very public about it, right? We wanted to be known as the folks who are saying, hey, this type of valuable investment strategy, this approach to financial health and a healthy financial life was something that everyone deserved. We even put it in our mission statement, right? You know, that everybody deserves sophisticated financial advice. So, but yeah, it was very rampant. It was rapid growth. As you pointed out, I think we grew something in assets. I think we grew almost 45 times while I was there. Obviously, our client base, I think we had about 1,500 clients when I joined. I left, it was close to 90,000. But I was very proud of the technology. I was very proud of the team. And more than anything, I was very proud of the fact that we served our purpose also as kind of a provocateur for the industry, right? I told the whole team at Wealthfront that the reason Vanguard was such a great organization and great company was not just because they had millions of customers who got better products and services at a better price from Vanguard, but because Vanguard exists, it forced all the other competitors to roll out better products at better prices for their customers. You know, I would tell the team at Wealthfront that there are millions, tens of millions of people who are going to get better financial products, better financial advice at a lower cost, who will never be Wealthfront customer, but they will get those benefits because Wealthfront exists. And so I think when you keep that focus, if you really are building something disruptive, it turns out that you can be inspired not just by what you do, but the influence you have on the entire sector and the entire industry.
Yeah. What do you think the valuation change was from your start to beginning?
Valuation change? Sorry.
Yeah. What do you think the valuation was when you took over versus when you left Wealthfront?
Oh, well, I think, listen, it was a team effort and there's a lot of folks involved, et cetera. But I mean, when I was at Wealthfront, it was on a bridge loan, right? There was, you know, if they didn't raise money within a matter of months, there might not be no Wealthfront. There might not have been a robo-advisor boom, to be honest, given everything that was going on. I think the round that we did raise a few months after I joined ended up being priced under $100 million. And I think the Series D that I led, or that I ran the process in 2015, was over $700 million in the end. And so now I think Wealthfront, I mean, look, I'm biased. I think Wealthfront is worth billions now. I mean, they just put out their numbers and very exciting the progress they've made. But I remember just the skepticism. Like I said, one thing that's been universal almost in my career is just the amazing amount of skepticism that people have about anything that isn't the status quo. That the number of engineers I had to convince that LinkedIn would ever be worth anything, let alone billions of dollars or tens of billions of dollars. I mean, I think LinkedIn actually just crossed 1 billion users, over 15 billion in revenue in 1 year. I mean, I cannot tell you how hard it was to convince anyone that a business that was basically going to help people post their resume online was going to be worth anything.
Yeah.
In the long term. Wealthfront was the same way. If you talk to Drew about Dropbox, some of the same skepticism. I think eBay, I mean, you're really going to build a site, you know, letting people sell, you know, broken laser pointers and Beanie Babies. So that skepticism is always large. And we see it in the current giants, right? I mean, how much skepticism did Airbnb have to deal with in the early days, et cetera? You have to have a fortitude. You have to believe not that it is going to happen or it's a guarantee, but that it's possible. And you have to have this clarity of thinking back from the future of, okay, what does that look like? If that is possible, what do we have to do now? And then figure out what you have to do in the short term to meet that long-term future. I mean, that's the problem that we all struggle with, I think, as founders and as investors.
Well, I see these days at Daffy, like you're not just subbing out the work of becoming well-known to the team. Like you're willing to be on the YouTube videos and the TikToks, and you're writing your own blog and these kind of things. Let's talk about Wealthfront. This idea of wanting to be known. When you think about those products that would really benefit from that, but yet CEOs shy away from it. I mean, why do you think that is? Why do you think the ones that really would benefit so much by being known maybe revert back just to great product, or they don't put the same time and effort into being like, have a great product, actually have people find out about it?
Oh, there's a lot of very smart people and successful founders and CEOs that believe that time spent public facing is not the best time to spend, right? So I don't want to take so much credit for that. I think that I've had a background in career. I mean, maybe it's the reason I ended up at Apple in the beginning in the first place, right? Like at some level, there's a part of me that wants to be an evangelist, that wants to, tell, not just know important things, but share them, etc. I mean, I'm a teacher. I teach a class at Stanford, personal finance for engineers, 7 years. So I do like talking. I do like explaining things. But the way I see it is it has to do with your strategy, right? There are some strategies that benefit from kind of being public facing and being well known. And there are some strategies that don't, that in fact, it's kind of, in fact, with LinkedIn, we specifically in the early days did not give away everything we were doing at SEO. Because LinkedIn was fundamentally a network effects business, right? It was a bet that if we get this to sufficient scale, it'll be very hard to stop. This platform of knowing who people are and who they're connected to would be amazingly valuable at scale, but it takes time to get to scale. And so the truth is there's some risk that comes from being very public facing about this. So I think that the best CEOs, the best founders are in touch with the strategy that they're executing. And so I like to think that for a lot of CEOs, if they're not public facing, if they're not putting the time in, that it's part of their strategy, that that's not the key to their success. That's not key to their long-term vision. But on the flip side, I would say that sometimes you see CEOs who just don't have the training or the background to do it. And they fall into that common trap that a lot of leaders fall into, right? Like when you're in a leadership position, when you're in front of a lot of people, it's very hard for a lot of people to have humility or admit that there are things that they're not experts in or things that they're not great at, things that they learn. I think that the best leaders you see always have a growth mentality. I mean, I think if you look at tech giants, et cetera, some of the best leaders and founders, wow, do they transform over time, right? You watch Brian Chesky speak now about Airbnb versus what he did in the beginning, or even Mark Zuckerberg, through his, leading Facebook early days, et cetera. No matter what you think of these people, you agree with them, the transformation, the elevation, the skill set and the growth. I think you see the best leaders grow into it, but I do think there are some CEOs and founders shy away from being public facing because it's not something they're trained in, they're not great at it, and they don't want to make a mistake, and they don't want to invest the time to learn.
Yeah. So if we were going to wrap that up, thinking about, these folks that it does align with their strategy, and they are, there's no guarantees, but they're shooting for this $1 billion plus success story, and they're a little intimidated. There's risk there, there's fear of judgment. There's all these things that maybe hold back from getting started. What's your advice to them as the ones who are like, no, I'm going to do this? What's your advice for them as they get started on it?
Being public facing,
Mm-hmm.
speaking and being
Yeah, just like, I mean, we all know that it's much easier to get attention for a human than for a logo. Like get attention for the CEO, have the CEO point that attention at the brand, right?
Well, listen, I think there's a few different steps. I mean, one, it goes without saying what support you have for this learner, right? The team you have around marketing and communications, right? You can read pages all you want online, but having a high quality accountant is a different experience when it comes to understanding accounting. You can read, once again, up online, et cetera, but hiring a high quality attorney is very different than trying to do it yourself. And the same thing applies for all disciplines in my experience. And so if you're not working with people who are great at marketing and communications. You're giving up the opportunity to learn more. I think mentorship's important, right? Who else do you know who is actually very good at that you can learn from? A lot of what I learned about being public facing, I've learned from great folks, leaders that I've worked for, who I've watched, who I've studied. I used to go to conferences for no other reason than to see what other leaders, how they talk about their products and services and their platforms, what I liked, what I didn't like, what fit. I do think that learning is a big piece of it and that growth mindset. But the other piece is actually more internal, right? It's very hard to talk in a compelling way or do a good job representing your brand, whether it's to potential customers, partners, or to potential employees, right? I'm a talent brand guy, right? Half the time when you're talking, you're really not selling the next customer. I'm in Silicon Valley, right? Like the number one resource that everyone's worried about is the best engineers and designers, working on your team. But if you're going to give a message, I think it has to be internally consistent. It has to be incredibly simple. And by the way, there's framing, right? What is that? What you're leading people down a path. Where does that path lead? Is that where you want them to go? The best professionals in the industry do that almost intuitively and natively. But even those great teams, and you can look, by the way, it doesn't have to be in tech, it doesn't have to be in business, right? You think about like great presidents that you respect and the teams they built around them. You can learn a lot from how they decide not just what they're doing and why they're doing it, but how to talk about it in a way that takes other people on that same journey, that leads them to the same place. And I think, by the way, that's not just external. If I can't figure out how to speak about things externally, that usually represents a problem with me representing things internally as well, right? And I find that the best leaders have a consistency between the way they frame the problem for themselves and their team crafting the strategy, their employees internally, and then, of course, external stakeholders, whether those are customers, partners, or potential employees.
Yeah. We had one of President Clinton's speechwriters on the show. He wrote this great book about analogy called Shortcut. And, this idea of like, hey, if you are a CEO, if you are, chairman of an investment fund, like you don't have to do it all yourself, right? Like President Clinton had a speechwriter, and my guest talked about like writing these things and then handing to him, and he's marking it up to make it his own. And then he delivers it his way, right? And this idea of, I think, support and mentorship and all those things you said are so valuable.
And this is important, actually, as someone who comes from an engineering background, I actually do talk about this a lot when I talk about product leadership. It's somewhat of the difference. You can learn from other creative industries. But what is the value for people who write for a living? What's the value of an editor, right? And getting leaders to understand that they don't always have to be the author, right? Sometimes they're the editor. Sometimes they're the curator, right? What belongs together. But these different inspirations for leadership, that difference between empowering your team to bring their excellence and their insight and their focus to bear, and then serving as the role to make sure that it's all coherent, that it represents the product, the platform, the company you're trying to build, that really is at the heart of a lot of leadership roles.
Well, at my company, Greystoke Networks, where I make these shows like my show for other CEOs, right? I tell them, like, you're just going to get the same thing I get. Like, 7 people touch every one of these episodes. 7 people are going to touch your episode. By the time you have a booking specialist, a producer, editor, graphic designer, copywriter, social media person, like, all I do is show up for the cool interview. I'm like, I check my name. I'm like, oh, who's the cool person I get to meet this week? They're like, Adam Nash, CEO of Daffy, right? And I've got this whole list of like all your social media, all your, like, they've done all the research for me, and it makes my life really easy. And I get to spend the rest of the week running my companies, and then it makes this a lot more realistic to pull off, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's an amazing thing, and it's hard because part of it's about teams, right? It's about trust and working together. This will sound, trivial, but, I played team sports in high school. I played volleyball. Really, I guess I really am a California native, but I played volleyball in high school. And when you play a team sport, you realize that yes, there's individual excellence, but there's real power in coordination, communication, right? Strategy, right? Using the best of everyone on the team. And believe it or not, that's how I think of software. I mean, anyone who's worked for an organization under me or with me knows that I talk about software as a team sport, right? How do you get the best out of marketing? What makes a great marketer, and how do you empower them to do what they do? How do you empower a great engineer, a great designer, a great product manager, a great data scientist. I even tell people that, if you don't think highly of a given function or don't think it's necessary, it likely just means you haven't worked with someone who's excellent at it. But it's hard because all those things have different priorities, different focal points, different skills, and getting teams to trust each other. And then it does come from the leader. If your team sees that you don't trust the team or you don't empower other members of the team to take risks, well, guess what? They won't feel empowered either. They won't take the same risks. And you quickly can get to a fairly mediocre outcome. You have to be willing to trust your team and work with them. But you're always still the unifying force that pulls it together. And the bars you set for quality, acceptability, actions speak louder than words. I mean, everyone knows these things.
Well, okay, we can move on for this topic. Maybe final question on is, if the Wall Street Journal calls or TechCrunch calls, you're going to probably take that interview. But there's a lot of CEOs that don't take time to be on podcasts or have a podcast, things like this. In your mind, what's the decision tree? Why have you decided to do things like come on a show like this and go on other podcasts I was listening to before to prep for this one?
And part of it has to do with, kind of my personal bias, and part of it has to do with what I'm doing professionally. I mean, obviously, as the founder and CEO of Daffy, I want to get the word out, right? Like fundamentally, as I told you in the beginning, that donor advised fund, this idea of a tax advantaged account for charity, it's not something most people know about. And I think it's immensely valuable. And so there is an education process there. And I wish I had Apple's budget for branding and getting education. I wish I had those billions of dollars, but it turns out startups don't. And so it turns out as a startup, there's some truth to the fact that you do things that don't scale. And so having me out there talking about the message not only is valuable to the company, but also is valuable in terms of us refining our message and how we talk to folks. So there's a big piece of that there. But also personally, it turns out that I'm a little bit old-fashioned. When I say old-fashioned, I mean Silicon Valley old-fashioned. I really do think that one of the things that makes technology special and Silicon Valley special is that every generation of leaders, founders, entrepreneurs, there's a reason why they become angel investors and teachers and venture capitalists, et cetera. Part of the motivation is to advise and guide kind of the next generation of founders, et cetera. And so part of the reason I do these talks is because I love sharing what I've learned. I know that some people will out there listen and say that he's totally wrong. I'm going to do it my own way. And by the way, you might be right. There's a lot of different paths to success. But, with the founders I work with as an angel investor, with the students that I teach in my classes, and anyone listening to this podcast, what I'm hoping is that some of my insights make them a little bit more successful, increase the chances of success for their company, their dream. And if nothing else, help shape the conversation about how we keep this wonderful tradition, this wonderful economy of building new disruptive companies going. Because I don't take it for granted. It's not true in most of the world, and it's not true everywhere, and it hasn't been true for most of history. So for me, it requires active effort of everyone in the system.
How many angel investments do you think you've made?
A little over 130. As you could expect, I have a detailed spreadsheet.
Okay, let's switch. Let's shift here. So this could be from what you're doing at Daffy, Wealthfront, Dropbox, LinkedIn, Apple, any of your experience. Thinking about, the founders of those 130 businesses you invested in, or everybody listening today, what's another billion-dollar success principle you'd share with us?
Well, I can share with you what I look for as an angel investor, right? Because I've actually talked to thousands of founders, lots of pitches, both professionally when I was at venture capital firms and then as an individual angel investor.
Yeah, Greylock. We didn't even bring up Greylock. Reid
Yeah,
Hoffman,
it was
amazing,
wonderful,
right?
wonderful firm and some wonderful people who invested in some amazing companies. But the three things I tend to focus on is, remember, most of my investing happens at the very early stage. So what questions you'd ask a founder or a CEO at a later stage, a Series C, a Series D, is very different than at seed stage or pre-seed, et cetera. And I mostly invest at seed stage. But the three things I really look for in the founders I talk to, one is I look for an authentic fit between the founder and the market they're building for, the product, right? And this might be askew because I'm in consumer and fintech, but there's a lot of founders I meet who really their motivation is just to make money. Hey, I found a way to make money. Building companies is really hard and it takes a long time. I know it seems like that could be the driver forever, but it's just not enough in my experience to actually build it. It's too hard. When everyone's telling you that you're going the wrong way and this isn't the way the world works, it's just too hard. So I look for authentic founder product fit? The second thing I look for is who does this product really create value for? I look for the economic value being created, right? It was very easy to see at LinkedIn what the economic value was being created, right? Most people at any given time are not unemployed, are not putting their resume out for jobs. In fact, in the US, that's often below 5%. That means that if you want to hire someone, 19 out of 20 qualified people for that role are not ever going to submit their resume. And so the idea of opening up a 20 times improvement in the access to people, to the labor, to talent was just phenomenal. Same thing for Wealthfront, right? The value. If you look at what people do with their own money, what we could do in software for them was meaningfully better, like would generate a huge difference in their retirements. And so the second question I always ask for is, what's the economic value creating for? And this is the key: for who? Because a lot of founders don't think clearly about the market segments they're going after, right? No product is the best thing for everyone in every situation. So that clarity of who you're creating the value for then leads to the third thing I want to know, which is distribution. How are you going to reach these people? What are the ideas? I don't need them to have figured it out, but I need to hear hypotheses where I say, oh, one of those could play out. When I went to Wealthfront, I remember brainstorming with the team, but I came in with at least half a dozen ways that we could reach the audience that we were going for, reach the customers we were going for. And most of them did not work, by the way. But we had a range of theories. So those are the three things, the advice I give to founders as an angel investor: the founder product fit, that authentic fit. 2, who do you create value for? How much value? And then third, how are you going to reach them? And if you don't have an answer for any of those three things, then I'm probably not going to write the check.
I'd love to double down on that last one.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about, you've spent so many years Silicon Valley and with these high growth companies. When you think about distribution, let's talk about principles for people who feel like, my distribution's okay, but I feel like I should be upgrading it. What are levers they could pull? What are questions they should be asking themselves and their teams?
Well, first, I'm glad they're thinking that, because you always can. Apple still thinks about distribution, and Apple is pretty successful globally. I think there's like 1 billion users now on the iOS devices, but pretty successful. But yeah, you have to always think about distribution, because it's never stable, because distribution isn't just about channels. It's not just about content. It's also about competition, right? It's not just with your direct competitors. It is competition there for attention, where it's driving. So it's good to always be thinking about it. But yes, I think that there's always a fundamental choice that I think as a leader or as a marketer, you have to be thinking about when you're thinking about growth, which is fundamentally, do you optimize the existing channels you have? How can you grow them, right? Can you boost the traffic from them? Can you boost the conversion rate? Can you reach more people this way, et cetera? Or are you opening up new channels, right? Sometimes the easiest way to make that decision is to actually think about what you're trying to do. Are you trying to expand the market or go deeper into the market? Usually, if you're trying to go deeper into a market you already have, well, then the questions tend to line up, right? Are there channels that can also reach that market, or do you just go deeper into the channels you have? When you try to reach a new market segment, maybe with a new product or an adjacent expansion, et cetera, then you have to be thinking more about, are my assumptions correct? Just because this channel works for my existing customer base, will it work for this new one? And very often the answer is no. And so I think that, if you haven't done that, all these teams in tech got devalued a little bit in the previous 10 to 15 years. I think it's coming back. I actually have a piece of advice that I've written about on my own blog about obsessing about your non-users, because that's where growth comes from, right? We all obsess about this data that we get from our users, every click, every conversion, every piece of feedback. But realizing that growth fundamentally comes when a non-user, when someone who isn't a customer of your product hears about your product, usually by touching a piece of content that either you or a customer gave them. The only way to be great at that problem is to obsess about it, right? And there used to be teams in marketing, market research, do a fundamental good job. And by the way, if you look at the giants, they have huge teams of people who really think deeply about any product or the market in general, where they see adjacencies, where they see market segments, to say, we're so close. If we just added these 3 things, we could really reposition and go after that market. But most startups don't have that luxury, and most founders don't think that way. They mostly come from backgrounds where they obsess about what's working already in their existing customers, and that's fine. But yeah, when you're thinking about growth and you're thinking about these channels, you need to think clearly about what you're doing, right? Like, at every company I've been at, I've forced the team, forced myself to have some sort of hypothesis at any given time of what was the market segment we were going after, what's the best way to reach them, and what message resonated with them. What did they care about? There's really no substitute for that when you're looking at growth.
Yeah, such good advice. Well, listen, I know we're out of time. Obviously, everybody should be going to daffy.org and get your own donor advised fund for you. Anything you want to leave us with today?
Listen, I'm just going to leave out there for anyone who's a founder, an entrepreneur, or works for a company that's kind of a disruptive startup. Um, just know that I know everyone tells you this, and everyone says it's hard. Some people say it's almost impossible. And it is hard. But to paraphrase from A League of Their Own, it's the hard that makes it great. It doesn't mean you'll succeed. You take risk all the time, but just remember that that risk is part and parcel to what you're doing, right? And so worry very little about embarrassment risk. Don't worry about things that might not work, painful risk. Do worry about fatal risk for your company, right? Like, you have to keep pushing. But fundamentally, this idea that if it was easy, it would already be done, that we're all operating in a competitive marketplace, that there are this myth of the low-hanging fruit, or that there's some business to be built that's just sitting there. I think you'll find that almost no leader who's been through it thinks that that's true. But you can see where there are weaknesses in the market, right? You can see the incentives of the big guys. If you haven't read Innovator's Dilemma, read it. If you have, read it again. Those basics of understanding that those large companies, the people you're competing with, have a business, have a focus. But if you're focused on a different market, one that they don't think is their best customer, you have a real opportunity to build something unique and valuable, and you can change an industry if you're successful. So, I don't know, a little rah-rah for everyone out there fighting the good fight.
No, I love it. Okay, everyone. Thanks for listening.